Welcome to Culture Lab Consultancy Conscious Culture Interviews. Let me tell you a little bit about that first before we get into today's interview. So it's basically, I've been doing these series of interviews with different experts who work with organizations and leaders in their area of expertise. And what I like to do is explore culture, the workplace culture, the corporate culture space with those experts. So exploring different perspectives and taking different perspectives around that space we call culture. So let me welcome Kate Nicholas. Kate, welcome to this interview. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed.
Delighted, absolutely delighted to join you.
Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just start off with your introducing you to everyone, and then we'll run through our conversation, if that's okay.
Brilliant.
So Kate is a management and communications consultant who has worked with a wide range of international and national organizations on strategy development, brand and organizational messaging and change communication. There's also specialist expertise in working with charities and faith-based organizations. In a previous role, Global Communications Chief for aid agency World Vision, Kate led external communications across 100 countries and internal communications with the charity's 45,000 staff worldwide, and led a global strategy process and change communications across international regions. It's got to be a challenge. I must admit, reading that has got to be a challenge. Before this, she was editor-in-chief of PRW Week, the leading magazine for communications professionals, where she experienced the good, the bad, and ugly of communication practice and helped to global best practice standards. It has also written for a wide range of titles, including The Independent, The Observer, Management Today, and Business Life, and has been a regular commentator on BBC One, ITV, Sky, and Channel 4 News. And she's also best-selling author and presents a TV show on Christian Channel TVN. You have a really impressive CV, Kate. Amazing, absolutely amazing. You've done so much. So, you know, in your title, you've got Global C-Suite Advisor. So what does that actually mean? What do you actually do?
Oh, it all sounds very grand, doesn't it?
Sounds brilliant.
Thank you for your kind words. Yeah, no, I've spent really about the last 20 years working very closely with senior leaders. When we say C-suite, we mean very senior leaders, chief executives, chief officers and boards and senior leaders in a whole wide range of organizations. I have got this specialist expertise in working with charities. I've worked with World Vision as Chief Communications Officer. I've worked with UNICEF, with Amnesty, and as a consultant with a very wide range of charities. But I've also worked with a whole range of organizations, private sector organizations, particularly who've got a strong corporate social responsibility flavour to them. They've a real desire to be responsible businesses. So what I'm really interested in is values-based organizations, I think is probably the best way to put it. And you know, I'm very blessed that the experience I had at PR Week was amazing. I got an absolutely unique insight into very different types of organizations. And you say, I did see the good, bad and the ugly, and was able to see, you know, what worked and how communications really contributed to effective, productive cultures, and how it could hinder as well. And then when I was at World Vision, I think that's where I really learned about leadership. I will say that when I was editor-in-chief, if I said jump, the only possible answer was how high. I then went into work with World Vision. And I remember when I was offered the job, the president said to me, I hope you know I'm going to hold you accountable for all of the communications of all of our 45,000 staff. But we're a federated partnership, so you can't tell most of them what to do. And actually, I think that summed up the challenge. And World Vision was the most incredible learning experiences, because that's where I learned not about management, about leadership, and about how to create cultures that actually enable the organization to work, to move in the same direction. Very diverse organization across different geographies and cultures to move in the same direction. And I think the thing that I've really found over the last few years is what's become very evident is, you know, we live in a digitally networked world. So it's become far more virtual over the last few months by virtue of the global pandemic. But even before that, we were seeing that we lived in a socially networked society in which borders all over the place were blurring. The borders of organizations were becoming more porous between staff and between external publics. And with operating within that kind of environment, communications is a really vital management skill. It's what I've found is working with very many different types of organizations, it's those that really seriously looked at their communications that were operating best in this new environment.
Yes, no, absolutely. So in terms of becoming a communicative organization, and that is the focus of today's interview, particularly in today's context, it's both internal and external, isn't it? So you talked about the 45,000 staff. Actually, there's a whole heap of stakeholders that for communication, for whom communication is relevant. So when we talk about becoming a communicative organization, are we taking all of, all stakeholders into account in that respect?
Yes, undoubtedly. One of the things I would challenge to begin with is, I know we talked still about internal and external communications. Actually, there is no such thing as internal and external communications anymore. The way in which organizations operate now and people operate in digital networked environment means that with these porous borders, anything you say internally can go externally very quickly. I've done a lot of crisis management throughout my career, and I advise people on crisis management. And a lot of the biggest crises I've ever seen have been when somebody has put out what they think is an internal memo to staff, which hasn't landed well, and actually has then been passed out into the outside environment. And has then become, so a lot of, I think it's a kind of false distinction these days. So I think you're better thinking about a continuum of stakeholders. And that's a continuum that goes very much to your kind of core kind of employed staff, your FTE, right the way through to your customers, your suppliers, key partners you work with. And actually, in this new environment, in a networked world, there's a space in between where actually people kind of can occupy both. If you think about the fact that an awful lot of organizations now, as you know, and particularly I think post-COVID, we're going to find a lot more organizations aren't necessarily employing full-time staff, but actually are bringing in the skills and capacities they need from a broader range of sources. So you're actually creating there's a whole kind of area in this middle of this continuum who are both internal and external. So I think for both the risk factors and the fact that we work in different ways now, the first thing I'd say is, let's not talk about internal and external. However, you will excuse me if I ever mention internal communications. What I would say is, it's a whole of organization approach. The whole concept of being a communicative organization is about empowering employees and others to share freely within the organization and about the organization. Now, I think when we say this to a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders, I sometimes get an intake of breath because it's a fairly scary idea. The traditional model of management has always been hierarchy, and knowledge is seen as power and information is seen as power, and there's always been a desire to control information, that you pass down information on a need-to-know basis to those that you feel need to know. And those who are given information are somehow seen as favoured and more senior and more important within an organisation. That's the very traditional communications hierarchy and operating hierarchy, but it's really outdated now. It's really outdated. So you know yourself, you spend a lot of time working with organisations on organisational cultures. A lot of organisations are rethinking this.
I completely agree with you, Kate. If you don't mind me interrupting,
please go ahead.
I think there's a whole thing about what information should be communicated and what information, that whole who needs to know what and when has its time and place. Actually, when we're looking at sort of inclusive communication, right? So let me bring that word in, inclusive communication. Inclusive. To the word communication. So really, all information within an organization, ideally, my opinion, should be freely available. There will be some information that can't be freely available because it's the nature of that information that needs to stay where it is. So there's a question of, well, how do you know what needs to be communicated and what doesn't? The bigger the organization, the more complex that question, I think, becomes. we then had these solutions, Facebook style workplaces online, intranet pages that create some, so we then look at technology as a way to enable that to happen. So we're slightly digressing, I think, but I think this is really relevant, though, in terms of creating or becoming or exploring what it takes to be communicative, because there's a question over the how as well as the what. I think
I wouldn't say it's a digression at all, actually. I think it's absolutely core, because at the core of this lies the issue of trust.
Yes.
It's about how far you actually trust your employees.
Sure.
And I think the default position has always been to hold on to information, to pass it out. And in order to become a communication, communicative organisation, the default position has to move to one of transparency, and then decisions are made about information that shouldn't be passed out for very good kind of competitive or business reasons. But it's a different starting place. It's a starting place of trust. And I think this current situation we're in has really brought this issue of trust to light. We're seeing some organisations, thankfully a very large number of organisations, are actually having to trust their employees. They're working in different ways, they're working remotely. And those who are trusting employees to do so and are empowering them are actually doing very well. And then you're also seeing those who are kind of very old school, who are desperate to get staff back in the office. I've had friends of mine who have said to me, my boss doesn't actually trust me to be doing work if I'm not actually in the office. This whole issue of trust has really risen to the surface, and it's an issue that has to be dealt with if you're going to become a communicative organisation, because it's your starting point. And I think working in a kind of digital environment, I think possibly one of the most tangible kind of examples of this is how organisations deal with online use, with social media usage. In the past, you get kind of organisations have very draconian policies. They often have very draconian internet policies. I've even come across organisations that threaten staff with legal action if they actually go online and say something about the organisation. But the reality is, companies and organisations are staff. We work primarily in this country, in the UK particularly, in a service kind of economy. Service economies are made up of staff. They are your key asset. Now they're going to spend an awful lot of their time working with you, maybe not within the walls of your organisation, but with your organisation. And so if they're going to give that much of their life to you, they are going to talk about your organisation. And every time they go online and actually say something to their friends about their working day, they're saying something about your brand and your reputation. They are actually helping to shape your brand. They're helping to shape your reputation. And I think at the end of the day, genie's out of the bottle. We aren't going to be able to put it back in again. And I think the key is, to be in a community organisation, you need to learn how to embrace this. And if you do that, you then turn your staff into one of your most valuable brand assets. They become your brand ambassadors. They're the ones who are actually living out the experience of the organisation and actually are providing the kind of proof of your brand claims. So actually, but they can be showing this is an incredible kind of turnaround that can happen. But to do this, you have to become a community organisation.
So what I'm hearing, I suppose, if I can put it in a slightly different way, but in my way, the way I absorb information and then relay it back. What you're talking about is that actually the key to your workplace culture, your organisation culture, and making it work for you, is starting with communication, is starting with the perspective that being communicative is absolutely paramount. And I put it that way because I think we make assumptions, don't we, in the workplace, that actually communication does happen unless you're putting formal communication processes in place. So what you said earlier about how when you speak to leaders about this, they get a little bit, this concept of the whole communication as opposed to, and not distinguishing between the internal and external space, because actually when we go external, we become formal. And there's a certain point I think that starts to happen, or maybe that happens all the way right from the beginning, but somehow that gets divorced from the way we communicate with our employees. and the way then people engage with each other as well. So communication is it's not just a thing or a process, it's actually what we do in its entirety all of the time within the organization.
I'll say that communications is no longer a function in the 21st century. It's a way of operating in a networked society.
Yes.
It is a whole of organization approach.
I like that. I like that a lot. I really do. So our ways of working have actually changed. The way we communicate has to change, doesn't it?
Yes. And I think there are very definite things that you can do. I was there are kind of 3 key areas that I think that people can focus on in order to become a more communicative organization. That's modeling communicative leadership, building the space and capacity for communicating well, and then building a shared understanding of who you are, your identity, where you're heading, your vision, and how you're going to get there, your strategic roadmap. And so I think, if you take those 3 areas, if you take modeling communicative leadership, I think one of the first things you're going to have to do, and I'm afraid I won't use this phrase now, but prioritize internal communications.
Right.
Everything begins internally. Research has shown that 60% of organizations don't have a plan for how they're actually going to communicate with their employees. They will have very complex, very sophisticated plans for how they're going to communicate with their customers and various external stakeholders, but they haven't looked intentionally at how they're going to communicate with employees. When I was at PR Week, I was very aware that the bulk of people that I talked to, or companies I talked to, were all focused on external communications. And in actual fact, internal communications, sorry, I keep using that phrase, but it's employee communications, when done well, is a very, very sophisticated proposition that can really help sustainability and productivity of an organization and company. And I think this is particularly important now. We've moved into a new phase of remote working where staff have this enormous uncertainty. And I think at a time like this, good employee communications can be the glue that can hold an organization together in very difficult circumstances. And I think, there's one of the things that we have to do is we have to actually build the capacity of leaders to communicate.
Yeah.
We have to see communications as being a core leadership competency. It's not a department, it's a leadership competency, a management competency. And I think that has to be done through recruitment. Organizations need to look at, when they're recruiting, they need to be looking at the communication skills of their leaders, their ability to inspire, their ability to engage in dialogue. But also it's about building capacity of existing leaders as well. And there's a whole range of things you can do to do that. First of all, I think one of the things that's so important in terms of communicative leadership is working out what your key messages are, what it is you're actually trying to convey. Just because we're wanting to have just because I'm talking about an open kind of organization, open culture, doesn't mean you don't need to plan out how you communicate.
Sure.
You need to be very clear about what it is you're trying to communicate. And I do a lot of work with organizations on looking at their kind of organizational narrative and looking at how staff can actually see themselves within that. I think you need to build the capacity to actually how to communicate, including some of the less obvious ways. Only 7% of what people get from our communication is verbal. There's a huge range to communication. There are real challenges, particularly in this environment where we may be communicating through channels like Zoom, for example. So there's a whole learning that needs to happen. And it's not always going to happen naturally, but it doesn't mean that people can't become very good communicators. And I think the other key thing I'd say is that leaders need to understand their audiences. If you compare to external communications, marketing departments and communications departments have very, very, very sophisticated ways of segmenting audiences, understanding different groups, and actually understanding their motivations. They look at very sophisticated ways of actually understanding these audiences so they can communicate effectively with them, because communication has got to begin with those you're communicating to. You don't generally, there are a few outstanding exceptions, but generally organizations don't pay as much attention to their internal audiences, because staff, your staff or your employees are not a homogenous group. They are made up of different people of different ages. They have different job functions, which mean they come at the organization from different perspectives. And there are also much more subtle differences as well in terms of kind of psychographics and behavioral differences as well. And when you look internationally, as I've done a lot of work working with global organizations, there's a whole range of nuances there when you're looking at different cultures internationally. Oh my goodness.
Yes. Well, no, I completely concur with you. When you work with an organization that has locations in different countries, geography from the Far East to South America, the cultures are different, the ways of communication are different, and that's not taking into account the language, the way we live, and all of those influences. That's just looking at it from a workplace perspective, and how people relate to that environment. It changes. It's different to what we know because it's a different culture. But yeah, no, I definitely understand that.
And they're kind of the way in which people actually receive and process information differs as well. So if you look, there are kind of what they call sequential cultures, such as kind of North America, Germany, Sweden, UK, where people process one idea after another. That's why we have agendas to take items. We tend to like rather strict agendas. But then
I've read that as linear. We're very linear.
Very linear. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Linear or sequential. But then you've got more synchronic cultures, such as those in South America or Southern Europe, where they're more in the interrelation of ideas.
Yeah.
And so how you actually communicate needs to have a kind of consistency. You need to have a consistency in terms of core message, but you need to be able to actually communicate in a way that's going to resonate with those different audiences.
Are we now talking about adapting the way we communicate relative to the audience itself? So that the audience could be geographical, where it is in the world, or driven by where it is in the organization, where the audience is within the organization. And then you've got obviously your customers as well as other stakeholders. So there's a whole load of dynamics going on here, or complexities.
There are. And I think one of the most important things, so I'm going to come to the second thing I always talk to people about, is that you need to make the space to communicate. Once again, we're not looking here at some kind of top-down communication. You need to foster a communicative culture. And that, a lot of that is about adopting a learning posture, having a culture that adopts a learning posture, a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn, and a recognition that not all good ideas start at the top. But it's also very much about permission. It's about giving permission to share information, permission to have opinions, and permission to discuss ideas. And it's a willingness from leaders, again, it comes back to being a communicative leader, but willingness of leaders to accept challenges.
Yes.
And to willingness to be challenged. And so I think that a lot of organizations can find that quite challenging. But it's really about becoming a learning organization and being willing to learn from your employees. And then you need to then create the dialogue. You need to create dialogue and channels. I think the most important thing I would say is that you need to be thinking about how you're going to create dialogue with your staff. We live in a consumer culture. There's a huge expectation, particularly, for example, among millennials, of choice. Choice, the ability to engage with information, to dialogue with information, to question, to interrogate. Millennials are the largest generation. Well, they're the largest generation currently in employment, and they're going to increase by 50% in the next decade. The things that they prize most of all are their relationships and dialogue. And when they are looking at where they're going to work. One of the things they say they want is they want a culture that enables dialogue.
Yes.
That enables them to have a say in the direction of the organization, that enables them to help shape the culture and the organization which they're joining. They're no longer passive recipients. They don't want, so when it comes to communication, they don't want to be receiving communications from on high. They want to be engaging with me in meaningful dialogue.
Yes.
Around ideas and the future direction of the organization. So it's really important to create that dialogue. But you also have to create the channels with which to have that dialogue. And of course, there are so many kind of, technologically, there are very many available. But then you have to think about the cultures that you're operating in and how people want to have that dialogue. You know, you've got smartphone cultures such as the US, Canada, UK, you know, where people have information at their fingertips, they're able to collaborate in real time. And again, they expect to be able to kind of find information, to dialogue with information. And one of the critical things to remember is that, you know, they are engaging in this way with information outside in their home lives, in their personal lives, and they're bringing all those expectations in. So when they then meet, so they're empowered so much in their daily lives.
Yeah.
But then when they come into an organization that doesn't empower them, there's a real kind of cognitive dissonance takes place. And it does undermine trust, it undermines engagement. So you need to be able to create ways for people to dialogue internally. There, you know, in terms of how you do that, there's so many different kind of, there are apps out there and so many different platforms out there to do that. But the other thing is, you know, I think you need to recognize as well, there are some cultures that actually don't prize that kind of interaction, that actually they prize face-to-face. Interestingly, Japan, one of the kind of most technologically advanced nations on this earth, on this planet, face-to-face communication is really highly prized.
Yes. That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think in Japan, it's also the way, you know, how language is used to communicate, because it's not always direct. The messaging isn't always direct in many of the Far Eastern cultures. I think it was. I think I read somewhere. I've forgotten the name of the book. Gosh, that just really stumped me. Culture Web, I think. And it was basically around how, you know, even in China, you've got to read between the words. There's a saying where you've got to read the spaces between the words, not the words themselves. So that's fascinating. Absolutely.
I'm actually going to look up, there's a terrific book which I want to actually kind of recommend to people. It's by Erin Meyer, and I'm trying to remember the name of it now myself. So
I think that's the one I'm talking about. Yes. Yes.
It's absolutely terrific, and it talks about, it's really interesting because I spent a lot of time working in the States as well. I did a lot of work with World Vision. I had a big office in LA, and I spent a lot of time out there. And I was fascinated because I love my American colleagues, but I know they sometimes found me vaguely obtuse. And it fascinated me when I read in this book that it's because they have such a direct communication style, and they think the British are kind of evasive. That are kind of what we think as subtlety is seen as evasion, and it was a real eye-opening.
It's a real eye-opener, isn't it? What I'll definitely do is I'll put that book in as a reference point in the description to.
It is the culture map. It is the culture map. Erin Meyer, the culture map. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Brilliant. I agree completely. I
read it when I was in World Vision. It just opened my eyes. I was, oh, now I understand why. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The thing I took away from, so your 3 stages of modeling space and shared understanding, the things I took away from that is about fostering that communicative culture around space and being able to create shared understanding. As you know, Kate, I'm very, very keen on and work in the area of psychological safety within organizations.
Yeah.
So that being the concept that describes the feeling of safety, people creating the feeling of safety in an environment where people can speak up safely. So it's managing the risk to self. And there's a lot of reasons why people don't speak up. And in creating that openness in that environment, in that space, I think is really, really important. And the other thing I wanted to just also share with you is if somebody once said to me that within the organization, within our typical large corporate organization, you might see at least 7 generations.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And we know each generation will always say, "Oh, the good old days." will always say, we never did that, or we always worked hard, you know. And there are certain things that we say in each of those generations until we get to the youngest generation who look at everyone in disbelief. And, you know, there's a lot of stereotyping that goes on in that environment, I think. That has an implication for culture and then the way we communicate and how effective that communication can be. And, you know, it can influence things like, well, there's no point in me saying anything here, or you know, my ideas don't count, or, you know, that comes back to, well, why we don't speak up in our environment. And you're talking about an environment where we can actually share ideas, because that's really important for innovation, agility, and productivity. So, as well as inclusiveness. So it's also relevant and interlinked and integrated, I think. And I really liked your meaningful dialogue point with millennials. And it's not just the millennials, is it? It's the people who are coming after the millennials. It's the generations after. So how do you create an environment which takes into account legacy, leaves a good legacy and sustainable legacy for those who are still coming on board? Because, you know, these organizations are not here just for today, they're here for tomorrow. So,
this is all about future sustainability. Just, you know, we're already saying millennials are kind of the largest kind of group employed. You have Gen Z coming up, and what is true of millennials, I'm saying, you know, this kind of expectation of, and a sense almost of entitlement to be able to kind of have a say, to be able to engage, to be able to shape, is even more pronounced. So I think this is about future sustainability for organizations. And I think this point about the third point about shared understanding, I think is so incredibly important. I remember when I went into World Vision, I had a very interesting experience, because I sort of sat down in front of, I was actually with the UK office to begin with, I sat down in front of the UK office, said, right, I think that this is the strategic direction I think we should take. And everyone sat around the table and they nodded. And then they all went away and carried on doing exactly what they were already doing. And I was like, that's interesting. I remember a very, very dear friend of mine, Charles Badenrock, who I ended up working with World Vision International, he was then CEO. He said to me, Katie said, a leader without followers is only taking a walk, which I thought was a brilliant statement. And it changed my whole approach. And I think, you know, particularly when I went on to kind of, you know, be leading all the global communications across all 100 countries, you know, I realized that the power of collaboration and the power of co-creation. And I launched it a long time ago now, but I launched a global strategy process where we did our first global strategy, communication strategy, and involved all 100 countries. We did it through crowdsourcing, we did it through meetings in various countries, and it was truly co-created strategy. And the sense of buy-in and the sense of momentum that it created was extraordinary. And I think one of the things that I've really come to the conclusion, I'm very keen on, is the idea of strategy as change in its own right. Because actually, when you co-create, when you bring people in and help them to participate in shaping the organization, in shaping the identity, in shaping the strategic direction, you get this immense sense of ownership, and actually it creates change as you're engaging them in the process. And so it's a lot of the work I do actually is working with organizations to, I was off my initial kind of like baptism by fire. I kind of became a great proponent of collaborative kind of processes to help organizations to determine brand, to determine strategy, but seeing that participation as part of a change process. And there's a lot of what I do. I work with organizations to help develop their kind of identity, their vision, their strategy. And also the other thing that we do is kind of around organizational narratives. I think that's one of the most powerful things I've done, is actually getting staff to talk about organizational narratives. There's a wonderful example, which I'm sure you've heard before, which I think everyone who does communications rolls out at some time or another, about when JFK went to NASA. He was in the hallway, and he encounters a janitor in the hallway mopping the hallway, and he says to him, so hi there, so what are you doing, NASA? It wasn't obvious. He said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. Yes. Now that was an organization that had helped to get this amazing buy-in, so that every single person in that organization knew the vision, the mission. They had a shared understanding of who they were, where they were going, and how they're going to get there, and could see their place within it.
Absolutely.
And that's what we should, that's what we should be aiming towards. That's what we should be aiming towards. In the old days, you know, you would, CEO or SLT would sit down in the boardroom, come up with this kind of, you know, strategy, come up with the brand, and then kind of roll it out. That terrible phrase, rolling things out. You know, but you know, these days, nearly all the work I do is far more collaborative, and the benefits are exponential. You know, as I say, you create change in culture as you do this, and also you unlock this enormous potential of staff to be brand ambassadors.
Yes.
When they come from a shared understanding, you no longer have to be afraid of them going on social media. You no longer have to kind of have draconian policies to try and stop them posting about the organisation. Because if they have that sense of buy-in and that sense of shared understanding, then actually you're unlocking enormous, that's how you unlock the social potential of an organisation.
Of course, yes, yes.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So what are actually then the challenges that, you know, leaders face in their organizations in this context? So even taken in today's context, you know, where we're changed the way we work, which means we're having to change the way we communicate. You've talked a little bit about the traditional context, but obviously all of this is now evolving and changing. So what are the current challenges, or are they still the same challenges?
Well, in a funny kind of way, I hate to say a silver lining, but there is this, any crisis also creates opportunity. And this crisis it has been a terrible, terrible period. I've lost people, others have lost people. It has been the most tragic thing to have hit the whole planet, really. We're still in crisis. But it has forced many organizations to actually shake up their way of working and to find new ways of working and new ways of engaging employees.
Kate,
I think one of the most powerful things.
Can I just add in there though? It's not just the pandemic either, is it? It's Black Lives Matter. It's about really having honest conversations right now about being an anti-racist organization, and a lot of organizations put out statements about being anti-racist and standing by Black communities and having but not doing anything behind that. And I think that's really key to communication, because I think the same issues that exist within how we respond to the pandemic exist also in how we respond to movements where we're trying to make things right. You know, so I think those challenges are really alive at the moment, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. As you say, Black Lives Matter has finally forced organisations to look at diversity as something far greater than the tokenistic kind of approaches many have taken. They've been forced to recognise the fact that there's a major, major problem with society as it currently stands, and that they play a role within it. And I think it's opened up new kinds of conversations. It's opened up more authentic conversations. You know, I think it's enabled, maybe forced many organisations to actually engage more with the idea that their staff and employees have a life beyond the workplace, and to engage with them as whole people. It's actually kind of a whole person. It's required a kind of whole person approach, hasn't it? More
a people-centered approach, absolutely.
But a whole person approach. There's been a great, there's a very great temptation to divide down your life into kind of what happens in the workplace and what happens outside. And I think this has broken down all those divides. And I think that can only be a good thing. That can only be a good thing.
I mean, you talked about opportunities, and I definitely think that's one of those things, is changing our perspective, our mindset, and our attitude. So what does this mean then for going forward, you know, for creating that communicative culture that takes into account all the things we've talked about? I mean, it feels like a huge, immense job.
Well, I think it's, at the end of the day, this is not something you can actually delegate to your communications department. This is about the core of organizational culture. It's not just about kind of leadership modeling communications. It's about, as you said, about psychological safety. It's about kind of creating an environment in people who feel safe to share opinions. It can be about the organizational shape. It's a lot easier to be a communicative culture if you be a communicative organization if you've got a flatter hierarchy, flatter structure. There's no doubt about it. Hierarchy does make this harder. And a lot of organizations are moving to flatter structures, but it's also about job control. It's about this trust issue again. It's about the level of autonomy that you're willing to actually give staff and employees.
Trust.
So it's actually, it forces a very deep reflection on the values and the way of operating of the organization. And I think critically, I think it's one of the starting points is being the organization's got to understand and really be honest about its attitude towards risk.
Gosh, you know, as you were saying it, I'm thinking it.
Yeah, it's something I think you have to face it head on.
Absolutely.
Only in that way you're going to reveal the barriers to being communicative. And I think particularly across cultures, it's not enough to say that you want to be communicative. It's got to be a real commitment, and you've actually got to ensure that there is truly a changed experience for all the stakeholders.
Absolutely. Can we just look at it in a slightly different, and draw it out a little bit more in terms of what it might mean for our leaders today? So, you know, the things that are coming to my mind are about leadership development, around so you're talking about communicative organizations, but we're talking really about communicative leaders, or, you know, leaders who embody
get
that.
Practical. Yeah, get practical. Get practical. Okay, if I was going to give people a list of things they've got to do, first of all, build the capacity to communicate. Take your existing leaders, train them, help them to be communicative. You know, I think, and also build communications into all of your recruitment requirements. You know, build it into job descriptions, build it into all your recruitment methodologies. You've got to actually be able to assess the ability to communicate, or the openness to communicate, the attitude to communication. I think is as important as the ability to communicate. How effectively is this person going to be willing to engage in? Are they going to be willing to engage in dialogue with their internal stakeholders, their employees, meaningful dialogue and authentic dialogue? And if they are, that's 99% of the battle. You can teach them how to do it.
Yeah,
I think a lot of it's about attitude. Understand your audiences. You know, a lot of something very practical I do with organizations is actually map your internal groups. You know, do audience segmentation internally. Look at them from demographics, including age, very critical, different kind of age groups. Demographics, geographies in terms of different cultures, psychographics in terms of attitudes and opinions, and also behavioural as well, which I think is where a lot of this kind of whole person approach comes in. And then, you know, then you need to look at what the characteristics are of those segments and what their information needs are. What is it they actually need to get there? What's the information they actually need? Not just bombarding them with information, but finding out what they actually need and what their beliefs are. What their beliefs that might act as a potential barrier to engagement, and to think about how you might overcome those. So that's a very practical piece that I tend to do. Then I think there's this thing about creating dialogue and actually then going out, and you've got to be willing to create dialogue. I think particularly you've got to be willing to create dialogue around even difficult conversations. And again, that makes people very nervous when I say that, but actually it's particularly important when you are going through a period where there may be very difficult decisions to be made.
Of course,
The default reaction of a lot of leaders is to get into a bunker. And they would rather kind of like, they would rather do anything wrong.
As you say this, there's a lot of organizations that are having to retrench, aren't they? They're taking decisions on downsizing. They need to, I mean, we see this in the not-for-profit sectors. I think the third sector reported 60,000 to be made redundant across the sector.
Yeah.
That's a huge number.
There are a lot of very, very difficult conversations going on right now, and they're being managed in a very, very different range of ways.
Absolutely.
But, you know, people, if you're willing to have an authentic dialogue around this with staff and help them to understand the reasons behind difficult decisions, it can be a lot easier for them to deal with. It's about respect, it's about dignity, it's about trust. Some of the worst examples, I think the word authentic is so important to have authentic and meaningful dialogues.
Yeah.
Some of the worst examples I've seen is where you get leaders will do a town hall. So on the surface, they're saying we're going to have a dialogue. So they open up a town hall meeting. They do something like Zoom. And what they do is they talk at staff. They might take a couple of pre-prepared questions, which they've already had in advance, and might answer those, leaving aside the difficult questions, and then leave. So that's even worse than not doing anything. It's so disempowering. And I think it does scare people. But the whole point is, just because something is authentic doesn't mean it can't be planned.
Yeah.
You know, I'm saying you can't be prepared for it. And so a lot of what I do is I work with leaders to help them think through what is the information they really need the people to engage with.
Yeah.
You know, what are the kind of questions they might get? You can think those through in advance, you know. What are the kind of things? And to think how you can answer these as honestly as possible. And you know, so and I also quite often work with leaders to run them through before they do it. But I think, you know, what I would say is that the most effective leadership dialogue doesn't happen from the very senior to the most junior. It happens all the way through the organisation. That dialogue should be happening at every level. It's not only senior leaders who need to be modelling this. It needs to be mid-management. It needs to be at every layer of the organisation. And it's not only dialogue top to bottom, bottom to top. It's also dialogue across the organisation.
Yeah.
You need to look at ways to actually connect employees with each other. So you've actually got both kind of, there will always be a certain element of vertical, inevitably, because you have got some decision makers, but you've also got to look at horizontal communication as well. So I think the other thing I would say is, you know, if you decide to do this, you've got to hold yourself accountable. Take a measured approach to this. Decide what success looks like. If you're going to do this, set KPIs, hold yourself accountable. This isn't something very vague. You can actually set yourself very different targets to work towards. You know, it is challenging, but I think if people do this well, it can boost engagement, it can boost well-being, it can boost retention, and it can boost productivity. As we said, it future-proofs for the next future-proofs the organisation. So it becomes the kind of organisation that forthcoming generations are going to want to be part of. And also, when you create a safe haven like this, you actually enable innovation. If people feel safe to express ideas, once again, it's about sustainability. You're enabling the kind of innovation you need to be agile in this kind of in this fast-paced world. And as I say, you unlock the social potential as well. So there's enormous benefits to be had from this if you're willing to actually ask some of the hard questions of yourselves.
Yes. That's amazing. Gosh, there's so much there just to digest and to think about. And my mind is just firing off in different ways and thinking of so many different things right now. There's a lot to take away, I think, for leaders today, and to be able to do something about being communicative. Thank you so much for that. Any final thoughts?
I remember when I was a kid, my mother always used to say to me, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I think probably one of the most important things I've ever said to me, and I think I say to people, is listen.
Yeah.
Communication is the two-way process.
Yeah.
So I think that willingness to listen, you know, and to recognise that communications is not a department anymore. It's a way of operating an organisation.
It's a way of operating, a way of working. Yes.
And just think about those 3 things. Build the leadership's capacity and willingness to communicate. Create space for dialogue. And create shared understanding. Look at ways to create shared understanding. And I think, you know, what I would say is, you know, I'm very passionate about helping people do that. So if anyone's interested.
Well, on that note, Kate, where can people find you? So if they want to get hold of you, I will put all your details in the description accompanying the video. But, you know, those who are listening, where can they connect with you and find you?
Oh, great. Well, you can find me on www.katenicholasconsulting.co.uk. You can also find me at LinkedIn, of course, and on Twitter at Kate Nicholas.
There you go. Brilliant. And on that note, Kate, can I just thank you for your time this afternoon today? It's a fascinating fascinating subject, and I think we could probably carry on and on and on, but we do need to close. So once again, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And
Thank you.
I'll end the stream.